Governments around the world generally use Keynesian system and Keynesian economics in different situations and policy making as it is more applicable in the short run. However, in the long run, we still go back to our classical aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Although we don't need to learn in great details how the classical system and the classical aggregate demand and supply is derived, it is important to have at least a brief idea of how we understand the GDP or the income created in the classical system and the relationship with price, because the Keynesian system is a modification and adaptation of this classical system, but in a different circumstance, which we'll go through in the future videos. When we talk about the classical system, the classicals assume that the resources in the economy are finite, which is true for the Keynesian system also. And if the entire economy uses all the resources to its optimum level, to its full potential, we will read a theoretical aggregate supply. Let's say that in the economy we have four factors of production. We have land, we've got labor, we've got enterprise, and we've got capital. In the modern world, we don't use these factors of production in the sense that it was understood in the classical system. However, we still do have the same notions in our time also. Let's say that in this theoretical model, land, we have 10 units of land, we have 10 units of labor, 10 units of enterprise, and 10 units of capital. If we add all them up, they should be equal to 40. And through the classical system, it is this 40, it is this theoretical potential that determines the aggregate supply in the economy. The aggregate demand curve is a downward sloping demand curve, which is derived from the fact that the aggregate demand curve is a downward sloping curve which is derived from individual demands. We know from our basic economics, our basic microeconomics, that as the quantity of a good increases, the price decreases, and as the quantity of the good demanded decreases, the price increases. And if we can aggregate that along with the wealth effect, wealth effect simply implies that as the as the prices in the economy decreases, assuming all else constant, assuming nothing else in the economy changes, only the price decreases. If the price in the economy decreases, theoretically speaking, I should have more purchasing power. So purchasing power increases. What does that mean? Let's say that I have $100 in my pocket, and these $100, let's say in this economy, I can only buy apples. I can only buy apple. There's no other product in the economy. Let's say one apple costs $10. So theoretically speaking, this I can only buy a maximum of 10 apples, but then the prices decrease. Let's say the price decrease from 10 to $5. This way I can now buy, instead of $10, I can theoretically buy almost double that amount. I can buy almost 50. I can buy almost 50 apples. Let's say the price decreased from 10 to $5 in this theoretical, hyper oversimplified economy. Then theoretically I should be able to buy, instead of 10, I should be able to buy around 20 apples. If nothing else changes, that is going to cause an increase in the GDP, because more consumption, therefore more investment, therefore the GDP should decrease. If there is more consumption, there's more investment, and therefore theoretically as the number of apples consumed increases, our GDP should increase. And that is a very simplistic way of understanding the wealth effect, which is enough for our understanding for this situation. And when we combine these two, we get our theoretical prices and theoretical aggregate demand in the economy. One thing that is important to keep in mind is as to what happens when the aggregate demand in the economy increases. This is one thing to keep in mind as to what happens when the aggregate demand in the economy increases. This is something a bit different from the Keynesian economics. So if the aggregate demand in the economy increases, because this is GDP, let's say we have the prices, and let's say this is our P1, let's say this is Y0. As the aggregate demand shifts towards the left, let's say the government implements some sort of monetary or fiscal policies, only the prices in the economy increases. The prices in the economy go from P1 to P2, and the income in the economy stays the same. And the idea behind that is, as individuals demand increases, our resources are still constant, and therefore if the resources are constant, it's only going to put an upward pressure on the price, and the prices will increase, causing inflation in the economy, which is in line with the Fisher's equation, mv is equal to py, where we assume that the output y and the velocity of circulation v is constant. Therefore, as money supply increases, our price increases, or anything that causes increase in price will cause an increase in money supply. This simple understanding is important to keep in mind, as this is very different from that of the Keynesian economics. So the only way in the traditional sense, the only way in the classical economics where we can increase GDP in the economy is by improving our aggregate supply. It is only when the aggregate supply shifts towards the right, a new equilibrium is created with lower prices and a greater GDP. And for this reason, generally speaking, classical economics is also called as a supply side economics, because there's a lot of emphasis based on the supply side, whereas the Keynesian economics is said to be more demand sided, where the aggregate demand is said to have an emphasis.